Thank you, Madam Chair. It is my pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill 43. You know, I can appreciate, and I do often reflect on the fact that budgeting with so many billions of dollars across so many programs is difficult. I don't think that this is an easy job that the government does. And it is fair that we may underestimate expenses from time to time, and that's why we have supplementary supply. But I'll also just assert that Albertans expect us to do the hard work. They expect the expertise in the public service to strive for accuracy where we can. And with a supplementary supply budget totaling just over $492 million, I feel that this government has demonstrated that they can't be trusted to accurately plan spending and can't accurately account for excess funding. I feel like the UCP government is wasting money in some areas, underspending in others, and then overspending. And a little of that can be explained, but a lot of it demonstrates incompetence. I'm going to focus my comments today on the supplementary supply for the Ministry of Forestry and Parks. It is the bulk of supplementary supplies associated with $251,378,000 supplementary supply for forestry and parks. Now, the supplementary supply estimates says that this is to be combined with $455,422,000 from contingency for wildfire pre-suppression and response. And like my colleague from Calgary Foothills, I appreciate that we can't predict the future and we can't know where the wildfires are going to be this summer and how extensive or intensive they're going to be. And so it is natural that some of this wildfire response money would come out of contingency funding. And we discussed this as part of contingency funds in the budget. But what I really want to focus on is the unanticipated $251 million that are not coming from contingency, but coming from supplementary supply. So here's what do we know about wildfire. I mean, I could really talk about that for way longer than 20 minutes, but just some high-level things. Well, we know that the extent of wildfires is high and growing. We can expect that every summer we will lose hundreds of thousands of hectares to wildfire in Alberta. We know that wildfire will threaten communities in the wildland-urban interface, and we also know that it's much more expensive and traumatic to rebuild a community than to protect a community in the first place. We also know that models show, I thought you were going to call a point of order on me. I was like, what are you doing? Sorry. We also know that climate models or wildfire predictor models show that fuel load is the best predictor of fire risk. And when we know that, we can predict the areas of the province that have the most likelihood of having or experiencing intense wildfires. So all of that information combined, Madam Chair, helps us predict and understand in advance where we might see the worst wildfires, which communities are most likely to be affected, and where we might want to allocate some pre-planning money to help those communities. So I guess part of my question is how much of this money in supplementary supply, this $251 million, went into fire pre-suppression instead of response. So the supplementary estimates says that this $251 million is to provide for wildfire pre-suppression and response for addressing the costs related to 2024 wildfires. I think the wildfire response piece is difficult to pin down early on, but I also think the pre-suppression piece and the preparedness piece is not as difficult, and I think we can do better in that regard. So how much of these funds were reactive? And could some of these funds been proactively planned for to support communities to address fire risk? For me, that is at the heart of this question around these supply estimates. This last weekend, as the MLA for Banff-Kananaskis, I hosted a wildfire preparedness workshop for the communities in my riding. It was attended by over 110 people We had 5 guest speakers of varying perspectives and expertise on wildfire. We talked about wildfire preparedness from the landscape level with prescribed burns and land use management, right down to the property level and fire smart in your own backyard and what you can do to keep your home safe. The number one comment that I heard from participants at this workshop was, are you going to do this in another community? Are you going to do this over there? Why are you the only one hosting workshops like this? How come the government isn't also hosting wildfire preparedness workshops? To which I said, well, I'm your MLA and I'm happy to do this and I'm happy to provide this information. But for me, it was very clear, Madam Chair, that there is a gap in information transfer and knowledge, that communities living in the wildland-urban interface don't necessarily know how to prepare for wildfire. They don't know what they can do at the property level, they don't know what their community can do, and they don't know what the role of the province is in funding landscape management to reduce wildfire risk in communities. And I wonder if that is something that this government might be interested in doing, because I do feel that wildfire preparedness is information that Albertans are hungry for, and they're scared about the risk of wildfire, and they would love more information. And recognizing that FireSmart is a website that people can go to where a lot of this information is housed, but also recognizing that not everybody is going to take the time to do that. And so I wonder if workshops like this is something that the government might be able to spend money on so that we don't have this demand of supplementary supply for fire pre-suppression, because we have educated Albertans and brought them along with us when we talk about reductions in wildfire risk. So why is the government not spending more money to share information with people who clearly want more of it? This year, the government announced the construction of fire guards around the town of Canmore, which is a welcome investment in reducing wildfire risk for the community of Canmore. But what of the other communities that are also at risk? Bragg Creek, Redwood Meadows in my riding are very afraid of wildfire, and there's no provincial money going into creating fire breaks around those communities. Why not? That should be part of wildfire pre-suppression activities and should be accounted for in estimates. What about plans for egress and evacuation plans? Most municipalities of any size or capacity will have emergency plans in place for wildfire, but smaller municipalities and villages may not have the capacity to create these emergency planning and evacuation documents. Is the government able to provide some capacity to these municipalities so that they know what to do in case of emergency and they've communicated that to their residents? The egress plans, I also think, are critically important, and it is an area where this government is kind of falling down. So Bragg Creek as a community has one egress. If that is blocked by fire, we will be sending helicopters in to rescue people, just like we did in the flood of 2013. So working with municipalities to provide egress, to provide residents with that safety and security and confidence in their government is essential. And these are all things that can be planned in advance so that we are not scrambling at the last minute when the fire is burning and ravaging across the landscape at like kilometers every half an hour. We could be more prepared. Some of the things I learned during the wildfire workshop this weekend was that the fire, when it came into the town of Jasper, it was not the wildfire itself that burned into town. It was embers traveling on the wind up to 1 to 2 kilometers away from the fire. The fire wasn't even in town, but embers blowing into town and landing on roofs and in yards started the fire in the town of Jasper. So I think communicating and educating Albertans to the need to fire smart their own individual properties is really critical. People need to not have a lot of debris in their backyard. They shouldn't have trees growing right next to the house. Even things like fences can direct a fire from the back of your property right to the house. There are things that Albertans can do to keep their houses safe, and some of these things cost money. A lot of the houses in Bragg Creek and Redwood Meadows are very treed, and even if landowners would like to remove trees to fire smart their property, they can't always afford to do that. So homeowner subsidies and programs for homeowners to fire smart their properties would be incredibly useful, and again, could be a granting program that would be planned for in budgets so that we don't have to have this unexpected cost coming from supplementary supply. Fire pre-suppression is an essential part of budget planning in our lives right now, and in wildfire management, on line 2.1 of budget estimates on page 99, we've actually underspent wildfire management, and then we come back to supplementary supply and ask for more money. So it's strange to me that we underspend and then we're like, oh no, oops, we could have spent more, but now we actually want way more. If we just plan ahead for this stuff, like we know wildfires are coming, we should be more prepared for that expense. Do we have any data on how much money in planning saves us in the long run in wildfire response? I also have some questions about how that $250 million was spent, over what timeline, in what areas. I think that would really help us to understand the need of why it's in supplementary supply and not actual pre-planning for wildfire response. In 2023-24 budget, wildfire pre-suppression and response was not budgeted, but the government spent $45.9 million that year. It seems to me like this line of wildfire pre-suppression and response is a continual spending item that we're talking about in supplementary supply each year. So if it's a consistent expense, why is it consistently not budgeted in the main estimates? Why? We know we're going to spend this money. Why don't we plan for it and account for it in estimates first? I also just want to spend a couple of minutes addressing environment and protected areas and the just over $3 million requested for remediation work on contaminated sites, the restoration of contaminated soil and groundwater. Mostly, I have a few questions like, how long was the contamination at these sites known, and how long did Albertans have to wait for their reclamation to happen? How were the private entities who created this contamination held accountable? I understand that some of this expense was associated with some fuel stations that are no longer in use. The fuel stations have closed around the province a lot. We know exactly how much they cost to reclaim. So why did we need supplementary supply to augment those reclamation efforts? Did we underestimate the level of contamination? Was there inflation? What is the reasoning for this underestimation of reclamation in this area that we have extensive experience in doing this work? What steps were taken to not have these costs next year? When it comes to reclaiming fuel stations, we should have a list at the beginning of the year of which ones will be reclaimed, where, and what that reclamation looks like, so we should be able to predict that cost. Why did we not predict that last year? The government needs to be planning ahead, but I also see in the Environment and Protected Areas budget an underspend in the Ministry for Fish and Wildlife of about $2 million and an underspend in integrated planning of $4 million. Does that $2 million and $4 million then get allocated towards reclamation? Why was that money underspent in the first place? Especially for integrated planning when land use planning is such an important activity in Alberta to address cumulative effects and monitoring and all of those other things. So I guess I have a question about how is the budget overall for environment and protected areas actually a reliable prediction of where money will be spent. We're underspending in some areas and overspending in others. And what about the cost of reclamation for longer term activities like coal mining or oil sands tailings? If we have issues predicting the cost to reclaim a gas station, which we have extensive experience doing, how can Albertans trust that the government will accurately assess the cost of reclaiming oil sands tailings or coal mining? And how are companies held accountable for those costs as well? Thank you.
Any other members to join the debate? Seeing none, I will call the question on